In our previous Datum Line broadcast entitled Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, Part 36, we explored another popular myth, that America is the land of free choice. That's what we like about this country. And the reason you can hear my voice today is because your mother chose not to kill you before giving birth, and Dad decided not to kill you afterwards. America's evolving legal system now recognizes Mom's right to choose, but we'll have to wait for another liberating Supreme Court decision before Dad has equal rights to decide whether you live or die. The purpose of our previous message was to demonstrate the recurring link between a deceitful menu of limited choices and the inevitability of a predetermined outcome that's been ushering us into an anti-Christian, socialist superstate, the economic lifeblood of which is a man-made fiction called credit or fiat money. Since this is our third economic series in succession, it seemed appropriate to connect the myth of free choice to the subject of monetary reform, and to reveal how a socialist panacea will surface as the only alternative to a problem rooted in socialist ideology. Heads they win, tails we lose. To further illustrate my point, we reviewed an article from American Free Press back in July of 2013, in which Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is said to be solving an economic problem caused by his socialist predecessors who sold that country into debt slavery. Left unsaid was the fact that Hungary, like the United States, is lubricating its economy with fiat money created out of nothing, and that Prime Minister Orban is treating the patient with a National Socialist remedy predicated on another system of synthetic fiat money created out of nothing. Applying the same logic to America's killing of unborn babies, the solution to what the AMA does in their private clinics would be to nationalize those businesses and authorize the death merchants to continue killing babies under a federal banner. America's transformation from free enterprise to socialist central planning and control was accomplished in small steps over the course of 150 years, during which time we've seen a corresponding shift in government centralization and its exponential growth in Washington. An economics vocabulary that accompanied our now defunct monetary system simultaneously carried over to our present-day system of synthetic man-made credit. Our economic problems are not the result of glaring defects in the Constitution, the Bible, or the precious metals, gold and silver, created by the hand of God, and which served as money prior to their demonetization 80 and 49 years ago, respectively. America's economic calamities are the product of a credit system that violates every economic precept of Scripture, the Constitution, and the original Coinage Act of 1792, which was written to implement a constitutional system of national coinage. Our economic distresses are rooted in a well-entrenched socialist agenda for which only socialist remedies are permitted and offered on a continual and unending basis. As in Hungary, the United States is urged by Federal Reserve critics of the Marxist, populist, and Nazi persuasion to adopt a government monopoly of credit creation to replace the private Federal Reserve cartel, both of which violate the rules of biblical and constitutional law. Much ado is made about our loss of personal liberty in the wake of expanding federal legislation, accompanied by the power required to administer and enforce it. But we do well to acknowledge the most elementary and repetitive choice we've been making to help bring this about. It's the choice between external government and self-government, between external control exercised from Washington and self-control that originates with us and depends on a willingness to be governed by our conscience, or what the Bible refers to in Hebrews chapter 8 as the law of God written on the heart or in the mind. Personal behavior that we recognize as unreasonable and evil is that which is not governed by moral principles or conscience, and is often referred to in law as an unconscionable act. In a nutshell, those who refuse to govern themselves will be governed by others. But the others of whom I speak see themselves as the best and the brightest, the global elite who've already appointed themselves to rule over the masses. However, not everyone who they wish to dominate is sufficiently enlightened to accept this great political truth of theirs. So an army of young misfits must be continually created and cunningly coaxed into defying social norms under the guise of liberating mankind from the oppression imposed by the tyranny of religion, especially that religion derived from the Bible, rightly divided and properly understood. As a child, did you ever feel pressured by a group of your peers, or perhaps by teachers and textbooks, urging you to accept an idea or standard of behavior that didn't quite feel right? Something you inherently knew was wrong, but were unable to explain why. Life is peppered with unpleasant and confusing choices. To do what is right according to your conscience, or else to find acceptance by joining the group, the in crowd, and doing what's cool. By the time we graduated from high school and college, those awkward feelings about right and wrong had been anesthetized. We were liberated from that useless baggage known as conscience in days gone by, what we called inhibitions. This was no accident. We had been played upon by a cadre of social engineers, known as change agents, who carried out a hidden agenda to which our unsuspecting parents were oblivious. They still believed that the purpose of education was to instruct their children in subjects like geography, science, reading, writing, and arithmetic. It would take another 15 years for me to see this notion challenged by a local newspaper article that listed, as a qualification for public office, our city manager's background as a former change agent. Here's why one of those agents said we needed to be changed. Quote, "Every child in America who enters school at the age of 5 is mentally ill because he comes to school with allegiance toward our elected officials, our founding fathers, our institutions, the preservation of this form of government, patriotism, nationalism, sovereignty. All of that proves the children are sick, because the truly well individual is one who has rejected all of those things and is what I would call the true international child of the future." End quote. So said Dr. Pierce of Harvard University, speaking to about 2,000 teachers at a conference in Denver, Colorado back in 1973. This, quoted in Globalism, America's Demise, written by William N. Bowen, Jr., who at the time was a Baltimore school teacher of 25 years. This from page 20 of his book published by Huntington House back in 1984. Well, what a world. Teachers of America's unsuspecting children attended another of those innocuous conferences to learn more wisdom about mental illness and its principal cause. Imagine how Mom and Dad would have felt if they had been present to hear one of the featured speakers make the following statement, quote, "The American family structure produces mentally ill children," end quote. So said Ashley Montague, whose lecture in Anaheim, California was heard by 1,000 home economics teachers on November 9th, 1970. Today's message, Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, Part 37. It was the American family structure, governed by the law written on the heart, that provided an anchor for the children in my hometown. By that time, however, the Bible was collecting dust, and only for the first few years was it ever quoted by a teacher in any of my classes. You know, I still remember the Walt Disney cartoon of Jiminy Cricket, who used to sing a little jingle which always ended with, "And always let your conscience be your guide." Our parents sent us to school believing that circumstances were much the same as when they attended class, unaware that textbooks had begun to reflect major changes before they finished school in the 1930s. Little did they or we realize how our own lives would later testify to a new state religion being taught as gospel truth, beliefs that we faithfully carried into the world that awaited us. Throughout my 12 or more years of formal education ending in 1965, I was aware of only one classmate who came from a broken home. It was about 32 years later, around 1997, that I remember asking a 14-year-old boy how many of his friends had both their father and mother living at home. Try as he might, he could not think of one, which included himself. The public pays dearly for social engineering in ways that seem to escape general notice or conversation. Proud parents of honor students acquiesce to the unproven nonsense of evolution taught as if it were science, to a centrally regulated credit system of thievery as if it were lawful money and free enterprise, to homosexuality as an acceptable lifestyle, to the Holocaust of 6 million as an unassailable truth and an eternal guilt trip, to homogenized citizenship under a global government, to separation of church and state, when the purpose of government is to administer the religious beliefs of its own society. Ours is now the religion of humanism, which holds that man, elite man in particular, is God. While enduring this onslaught, children are donated as lab rats to social experiments like forced busing. It's not just a matter of whether you believe or don't believe in these religious tenets of modern Americanism. It's that you're not allowed to question them or to present contrary evidence to rebut the presumptions we're told to accept without fear of being ostracized or severely damaged by a well-organized and ruthless opposition. So what does all of this have to do with economics, you might ask? Everything. Because the word economics comes from the Greek oikonomika, meaning the science of household management. How could anyone hope to manage a household of his, her, and their children, every one of them, parents and grandparents included, being the product of a socialist education that rages against the institution that God ordained as the basic unit of government to help ensure social stability? It's the family, which, according to Ashley Montague, produces mentally ill children. Now, dysfunctional parents may indeed produce dysfunctional children, but is that a synonym for mental illness? Most of us are products of a hidden agenda that slipped into the schoolhouse through the back door, taking our brains to the car wash, under a program that was hatched in the early 1900s with the goal of restructuring society along new lines, called progressive. Public education was redirected by tax-exempt foundations such as the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, while old-time religion was targeted by the Rockefeller Foundation. In a recent Wall Street Journal, dated November 15th of this year, 2013, at page A13, the article entitled, "The Bible in the Bird's Nest," the author, Melanie Kirkpatrick, reminds us that it was George Bernard Shaw, an ardent socialist, I might add, who said the Bible is, quote, "the most dangerous book on earth," end quote. North Korea's dictator, Kim Jong-un, might agree. On November 3rd, he publicly executed several people by firing squad for possessing a copy of it. Paul Brandwein, in his book, The Social Sciences, at page 10 said, "Any child who believes in God is mentally ill." His book, published by Harcourt and Brace back in 1970. So, with diploma in hand, my generation was filled with high hopes and great expectations for the good life, a dream that would not last long. Reality soon showed us how little we understood the world that we pretended to know so much about. We traded our rights at law for privileges originating in equity, maritime, and admiralty jurisdictions, subjecting ourselves to regulations and penalties we never knew existed. Bank credit empowered us, Hollywood amused and debased us, media confused and deceived us, Drugs and alcohol sedated us, and strange new diseases haunted us, as welfare dependence became the new American dream. Our children rebelled, and marriages failed. Investments turned sour, our debts mounted, factories closed, while bankruptcy and foreclosure followed close behind. Now that's quite a legacy my generation of bondservants left to the next. And these are all interrelated symptoms of the same religious, political, and economic disease, but impossible to recognize for people who cling to the doctrines of secular humanist Freemasonry that we were being taught by the God-men. Oh, and we have God-women, too, like Janet Yellen, who's supposed to replace Ben Bernanke as Federal Reserve Chief. Another tribute to education, while we're handing out encomiums and accolades. Regular listeners will remember this has to do with a communication study done by Eastman Kodak several decades ago, in which I heard about maybe 15 years ago. They discovered that in day-to-day conversation, the average American could only communicate 6% of what was intended with the spoken word. The remaining 94% had to be communicated by tone of voice, body language, and facial expressions. That says a lot about our system of education and another agenda that hides behind it. So now that you're a little older, do you still bend to that politically correct peer pressure? It's in your face, spewed by media, pundits who bludgeon their victims with insult, New Age preachers who know more than God himself, educators, politicians, doctors, lawyers, and of course economists. My generation bathed in the warm, seductive agenda that, for some of you, still doesn't feel quite right. But what is that feeling? It's probably the law of God written on your heart, by which you are capable of governing yourself. And people who will govern themselves are not a burden to law enforcement or public officials in general. Wouldn't you think, therefore, that our officials would applaud any effort on our part to govern ourselves by severing our ties to the costly benefits and privileges that Uncle Sam has to administer and enforce? And in fact, they should encourage us to take care of ourselves, which government once did, in a way, when it protected the Christian faith in its free exercise. It was in a letter from the Apostle Paul that Timothy was reminded, quote, "But if any provide not for his own, and specially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith, and is worse than an infidel." This found at 1 Timothy 5:8. So what happened to the old-fashioned Christian work ethic that was once the backbone of American independence and ingenuity? It seems to have gone the way of the religion that spawned it, replaced by a form of state worship, wherein the problems of mankind are to be solved by federal legislation, funding, and intervention. On the front side of this last break, I had brought up the subject of the Christian work ethic. Now, that's a phrase that I remember seeing in print and hearing spoken from time to time as I grew up. But there seems to have been a change. In fact, prior to the FDR administration, prior to the Great Depression, which was an orchestrated event and could only have occurred as a result of a credit system, very, very few Americans were on public assistance. All of that has changed. You see, now, when a crisis arises, America calls upon Uncle Sam for salvation. As the recipient of our faith and obedience, Washington has, in effect, become our God. It's a subject of religion, you see. In his commentaries on the Free Exercise Clause that appears in the First Amendment, taken in context with "we the people who are of European descent," spoken of in the preamble to the Constitution, United States Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story had said that this free exercise pertained to the Christian religion and to no other. You can imagine how unpopular this interpretation would be today. But our ancestors simply wanted to prevent a government alliance with a particular denomination within Christianity, as was the case with the King and the Church of England back in those days. Now, to some folks, it may seem odd that government and the illuminated powers behind it encourage our licentious behavior and dependence on government programs, both of which undermine a Christian work ethic. Self-government, like self-employment, is a choice we're seldom encouraged to make. Joining the corporate team, along with obedience to civil law, is what's expected of us. But obedience to a higher law from God is unwanted competition to a system run by the God-man. Government, by definition, is what directs, regulates, controls, or restrains society in its behavior. So civil government is often associated with oppression, tyranny, and despotism. Tyrants who delight in ruling over and enslaving others need a justifiable excuse for imposing police-state measures. And that's understandable. One way to accomplish this is to fuel sensual temptations. Those don't have to be sexual necessarily. And our mass media, of course, is promoting these incessantly: sex and violence. Plant the seed and watch it grow. The consequence of which can be a bizarre, made-to-order media event that will legitimize more external government. It's a script written to guarantee a predetermined outcome which a pliant population will demand. In essence, government says to us, see, you couldn't control your own passions, so we'll have to do it for you in the interest of public safety. Hand over your guns. Follow the tentacles back to their source, and you'll be inside the Washington Beltway, since the prevailing wisdom is that national solutions are extremely expensive, and Uncle Sam is the knight in shining armor with a virtually open-ended credit account at the Federal Reserve. In order for a global government like the United Nations to replace him, it will require even deeper pockets, linked to an even bigger bank that supplies an inexhaustible line of credit created out of nothing. Same song, different beat. Well, enough about free choice, or the orchestrated absence of it. Let's move on to another economic myth, one of which surfaced during my high school days when my socialist history teacher told us not to fret about the national debt. You see, my parents' generation worried about that, being influenced by the old school of hard money where no one, not even government, could continue to spend more than was coming in without eventually going bankrupt. So their offspring needed reassurance, lest we adopt the same outdated logic. A spiraling national debt was not a problem, we were told, because we owe it to ourselves. Wow. I never would have guessed that someone who was in debt could owe the principal and the interest to himself. But here was a Columbia University graduate who said this was so. And my parents were sending me to a private school at considerable cost to learn this kind of stuff. Get a good education, my dad would say. They can never take that away from you. I love my dad, but before that 4-year experience was over, I had concluded that the kind of education I was getting, they, whoever they were, didn't want to take away from me. Imagine a national debt being owed by the same guy who made the loan. So ludicrous was this myth that my 9th grade history teacher never produced an argument to support the premise. Nor would I have thought that this nonsense was a myth that received a patient hearing from anyone else until I read it in a magazine later on. There was a time in not-so-jolly old England when people were cast into prison for failure to pay a debt. Those were called debtors' prisons. But I seriously doubt that anyone avoided going there by claiming to be the lender of what it was he owed. I couldn't help thinking about the highly controversial protocols as I was putting this message together. The protocol said to be the notes taken at a secret conference in Switzerland during the late 1800s, ostensibly outlining a Zionist program of global conquest over the Goyim. That's Goyim, if you'd like to look it up. But it's a word that's recognized by Microsoft Office 2000 spell check program that I have. Isn't that interesting? The The relevance of those 24 protocols is manifold and compelling. For instance, in protocol number 9, and I'll just quote very few pieces of it, they said, in order not to annihilate the institutions of the Goyim, and you're going to be wondering, some of you, what Goyim are, before it is time, we have touched them, these are to be the institutions, with craft and delicacy, and have taken hold of the ends of the springs which move their mechanism. See, that's a rather poetic way of putting it, isn't it? These springs lay in strict but just sense of order. I should stop there. See those social norms that I mentioned earlier that we have to rebel against? Those are strict but a just sense of order. And the author of the protocols acknowledges that. However, we have replaced them by the chaotic license of liberalism. License, by definition, is permission to do that which the law does not allow. Chaotic, I think you understand. We have got our hands into the administration of the law, into the conduct of elections, into the press, today we would call it the media, into liberty of the person. Now, by that, I think they mean the licentiousness, if you will. But principally into education and training as being the cornerstones of a free existence. We have fooled, bemused, and corrupted the youth of the Goyim by rearing them in principles and theories which are known to us to be false, although it is by us that they have been inculcated. Have you ever accepted any of those theories? How about the theory of banking and credit? How about the theory of evolution? There are plenty of them to go around. In protocol number 8, in part, we find a note of interest which reflects upon our carelessness. Calling myself one of the Goyim, you understand. Think about the insurance contract you may have never read, or the credit or debit card contract that you didn't read, or the Patriot Act that Congress signed without ever reading. Quote, the administrators of the Goyim sign papers without reading them, and they serve in public office, either for mercenary reasons, dollars and cents, or from ambition. Now, that's an interesting tribute to our character. You see, whoever controls the volume of money or credit, as President James Garfield said before he was assassinated, is absolute master of all industry and commerce. If they can get those numbers for nothing, they can make the population do whatever they want. Oh, no, they can't do that to me because I'm independent. Now, all they have to do is throw out some free dollars. They put out a big pile of those in front of you to your left, and you'll turn left. If they put them to your right, you'll turn right. They know how to make us do what they want. Back to the protocols, this time number 8, just in part, once again. They said, we shall surround our government with a whole world of economists, a whole constellation of bankers, industrialists, capitalists. Does that sound like a government you recognize? And the main thing, millionaires. Well, this was written back in the late 1800s, and they hadn't experienced very much inflation, so forget the millionaire thing. Because in substance, everything will be settled by the question of figures. See, it always comes back to economics, doesn't it? In protocol number 10, we read in part, we shall destroy among the Goyim the importance of the family and its educational value. Well, the American family structure produces mentally ill children. So said our teachers, or at least the teachers heard it in Anaheim, California, back in 1970. Maybe that's why our children avoid marriage like the plague. Divorce and child custody statistics being what they are, marriage now looks like a plague because educators are teaching the chaotic license of liberalism. In protocol number 14, quote, When we come into our kingdom, it will be undesirable for us that there should exist any other religion than ours. You see, they have a religion. Everybody does, even if you have a religion of no religion, because that means that you are your own God, and that is a religion. If this gives birth to the atheists, we have plenty of them out there, it will not interfere with our views. Our philosophers will discuss all the shortcomings of the various beliefs of the Goyim. By the way, that word generally means cattle. But no one will ever bring under discussion our faith from its true point of view, since this will be fully learned by none save ours, who will never dare to betray its secrets. If there are any pastors out there, they need to find a copy, probably on the internet, of Elizabeth Dilling's book, Plot Against Christianity, to see why the adherents of this religion will conceal their beliefs at all costs. In countries known as progressive and enlightened, we have created a senseless, filthy, abominable literature. Well, this has contributed to the destruction of the family unit, but that's part of the cleansing program provided by the socialist agenda. The American family structure produces mentally ill children. So thank your lucky stars that America's system of progressive education is eradicating mental illness by teaching children about the folly of believing in God, creation, or the family unit composed of a male father and a female mother. In protocol number 20, quote, "Today we shall touch upon the financial program, which I put off to the end of my report as being the most difficult, the crowning and decisive point of our plans." He goes on, "Economic crises have been produced by us for the Goyim by no other means than the withdrawal of money from circulation." Regular listeners understand that. You see, banks were the suction pumps to pull all the gold and silver off the street and into the bank vault. And following that was the Federal Reserve's credit for money swap that left Americans with 100% credit and no tangible money by the year 1965. He goes on, "Loans burdened the finances of the state with the payment of interest and made them the bond slaves." States became slaves. You're aware that the gold standard has been the ruin of the states which adopted it? That's true. For it has not been able to satisfy the demands for money, the more so that we have removed gold from circulation as far as possible. That was the purpose of the gold standard, to remove the gold. Here in the United States, this didn't occur until 1933-34, yet the protocols were not translated into English until after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. How did they know? Who wrote this? So what is the socialist program these folks plan to introduce to replace it? Well, populists, Marxists, and fascists at American Free Press and the American Monetary Institute should be excited to know. Quote, "With us, the standard that must be introduced is the cost of working manpower, whether it be reckoned in paper or in wood. We shall make the issue," that means the issuance, "of money," that's funny money, "in accordance with the requirements of each subject," that's you and me, "adding to the quantity with every birth and subtracting with every death," end quote. You know what that is? That's the Canadian populist version, socialist credit, which finds favor with many Federal Reserve critics who seek to mimic the methods of the evildoers. Regarding the subject of a national debt being owed to ourselves, Protocol number 20 provides some insight. Say, quote, "Thanks to the carelessness of the Goy states," Goy, G-O-Y, Microsoft Office 2003 recognizes this spelling as well. Because of the carelessness of the Goy states, their treasuries are empty. You know what? Our treasury is empty, but it wasn't when the protocols were written, or when it was translated into English. But with the demonetization of gold, demonetization of silver, and now with a $17 trillion debt reckoned in dollars of absolutely nothing, the U.S. Treasury is empty. Every kind of loan proves infirmity to the state. Loans hang like the sword of Damocles over the heads of rulers who, instead of taking from their subjects by a temporary tax, come begging with outstretched palm of or from our bankers. End quote. Okay, every dollar in circulation in America enters the economy as an interest-bearing debt created as a fictitious loan by the Federal Reserve System to individuals, businesses, or to some branch of government. They say, foreign loans are leeches, which there is no possibility of removing from the body of the state. Okay? Well, why are foreign loans leeches? Well, from American creditors, at least from some of them, the government, and even you, might extract some element of forgiveness, perhaps, of some of the interest, or maybe even some of the imaginary principal, if it's a bank involved, if they're really kind, when push comes to shove. But let's see if Uncle Sam can extract the same consideration from a foreign country that holds some of our national debt. A country like China, for example, to whom we owe trillions of imaginary dollars. To default on an international loan of such magnitude is tantamount to an act of war. Now, make of the protocols what you will, but as the famous Russian dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn was said to have declared, they were written by the mind of genius. As the American automobile giant Henry Ford said of the protocols, everything in them has come to pass. Now, in the last few minutes, I scarcely touched the tip of this religious, political, and economic iceberg called the protocols. But some 30 years ago, they convinced me that whoever wrote them, and especially whoever presented them back in the 1800s, had incredible insight and even foresight as to the kind of world you and I would be living in. But you're allowed to ignore them if you wish. You see, as an American, it's a free choice. In our next message, we'll be covering a few more of the economic myths that I've written down for your consideration. And I'm in anticipation that maybe by the time we hit message number 40, we will be done with the myths. I keep waiting for people out there in the audience to submit a point of confusion or contention. If anybody out there would like to take issue with what I've been saying over these last 2 years and a month, just kind of let me know what it is, but try to be succinct, because I don't have a lot of time to deal with internet messages. I only pick up emails maybe about once every 2 weeks. There are just too many other things in my life, and I don't have internet here at my home. Okay, so, but if there are any things that you feel that I have been flawed in my presentation, then I would certainly be willing to consider it. Or if you think that there's an expert out there who takes another point of view, social credit, United States notes and that sort of thing, or a proponent of the Federal Reserve System, maybe we could arrange somehow to get them on the air with us, and we could kind of hash it out. It would be nice to have an open discussion about this sort of thing. But after we finish with this series, which will probably be in another couple messages, we will proceed to address the subject of what most people have been waiting for, I suppose, which are called solutions. But it's my belief that once you understand the problem, you shouldn't need to hear from anybody as to what the solutions are. You will know what they are, and you will begin implementing them, or you won't, because that also is your choice.